Greetings to you all. We are at lesson number 6, which is the prohibition of theft. Before we go into that, we will just look at a recap of what we did last week, which was lesson number 5. And we looked at, and that lesson was regarding prohibition of forbidden relations, which included the topics such as sexual partners and forbidden acts, marital status, including secular unions. We talked about adultery, guarding from forbidden relations, what is acceptable modesty in behaviour and our actions, and the binding stipulation for B'nai Noach, which was in the Divine Code, a copy of a marriage contract that is approved by the rabbinical authorities, which is something to consider if people are preparing to get married. So we will just begin now with lesson number 6, as I said, the prohibition of theft. And this is a considerable topic. It's complex, it's extensive. The laws cover many things that we probably don't even think about, but this list here it's not limited to this list, but these are some of the things that are discussed. So robbery with force or secretly stealing, benefiting from theft, defending oneself and property, false measures and weights, extortion, forced purchase and blackmail, borrowing, renting and loan collateral, also trespassing on property, and it continues here onto the second page. Also included in theft is kidnapping and rape, personal injury and damages, laws of employer and employee, delinquent debtors, ownerless items and lost objects, and maintaining peaceful societies. And just as a reference point here, we're looking at Genesis chapter 6, verse 13, and we can read this. God said to Noah, "The end of all flesh has come before me, for the earth is filled with robbery through them, and behold, I am about to destroy them from the earth." So the generation of Noah's time were quite wicked, and there's quite graphic descriptions in the Torah about this. So there were many things, many sins they trespassed, and the one that God actually punished them for, or the main thing, was theft. And as you will see from this list that we've looked at in the previous page, there was a lot of behaviour that actually comes under that heading, if you like, of theft. So the thing that tipped the scales for the generation of Noah was theft. Now, I'm just waiting for this next slide. Okay. So here we're looking at the 7 Noahide commandments, which, of course, prohibition of theft is one of them. And again, the 7 Noahide commandments reinforce that truth and justice must prevail, and that starts with us. And in Isaiah chapter 11, verse 9, and I'll just read that for you. They will neither injure nor destroy in all of my sacred mountain, for the earth will be as filled with knowledge of Hashem as water covering the seabed. So this is also an indication here that the generation following the flood were particularly careful not to breach any of the Noahide commandments, and they took stringent action and preventative measures regarding things such as rape and theft, etc. So the next generation following the flood certainly took lesson from what had happened prior to the flood. So, and this it also is a foundation of it. It was like a new world, so to speak, a whole new beginning. So the prohibition of theft, it actually, when you think about it, and particularly at the end of this lesson, it'll become obvious that it covers almost every activity of daily living. So everything we do each day has some reference to this prohibition of theft. And so therefore, according to the Noahide laws, we should take precaution not to fall into the ways of thieves and deceivers. And I'm sure we've all seen examples of this in our lifetime, perhaps in community, etc. So I guess it's an appropriate thing now to try to put a definition on robbery. So it is someone who secretly or forcibly takes something from you. Now that means a possession. It could be money, it could be your body, it could be in personal injury, physical or emotional. And also, there is no actual minimum amount of what the money is to be declared theft. So it can be one small denominational coin, so to speak. Now, before we go on to this slide, I just want to also remind you that in the Divine Code on page 504, and it's footnote 48, there is a writing from Rambam, and I just thought it would be interesting to read this because it just does say a few things. Now, this is from Law of Kings, chapter 9, verse 9, and this is what it states. A Gentile is liable for theft, whether one forcibly robs or steals money, or kidnaps a person, or withholds the wages of an employee, and the like. For all of these, he is liable and he is considered a robber. So Rambam sort of clarified that rather well. Now, Gentiles are forbidden to covet that which belongs to another person. And so what does coveting mean? That means it's sort of desiring another person's money, their possessions, or even their spouse, etc. And this comes in on that Divine Code and footnote 48 that I've just read to you. So the law is pretty strong about this. Laws of returning stolen items and restitution for theft. So this again is look, the prohibition against theft is such an extensive subject that you could spend a year studying it all. The details are so fine and very clear, but it delves into those fine creases or lines between an action. You know, is it on the border of theft, etc., or is it theft? So again, please appreciate that because this Noahide Essential Principles course is only as an introduction to the Noahide laws, you can understand that time does, and there's 7 classes, doesn't permit me to go into all the finer details. So it's my intention to give you that overview, a synopsis of what each of the laws are, so to speak. So, laws of returning stolen items and restitution for theft. Well, the prohibition of theft is an extensive and complex study of the law, and the guidelines that for some are for Jews and Gentiles alike, and some are just for Gentiles. And I've tried to include things that apply to Gentiles here. And there's one example that I'll read now, and this again comes from the Divine Code, the 3rd edition, which some of you may already have, but you can read it online. So this is on the page 515, starts on 515, 516. So I'm going to read this footnote to you. Likewise, if a thief, and this is just to illustrate the fine detail of law. It says, likewise, if the thief stole a ewe, that's a female sheep, an expanded effort to bring a ram, so the thief then went and got a ram to get her pregnant, this is considered appreciation in value that comes from the thief's action. So hold that thought. For which he may claim reimbursement from the owner. If this ewe gave birth while in the jurisdiction of the thief, whether the owner despaired or not, the offspring belongs to the thief. This is clearly the case, even according to Rambam's opinion, since this is not an increased value that came of its own accord, but rather through the efforts of the thief, who takes the increased value that is due to his efforts. Therefore, if this sheep gives birth, the offspring that the thief caused to be conceived belongs to the thief, even if the owner does not despair. So what do you think about that? It just shows you how, although the thief stole the ewe, which certainly has to be returned to the rightful owner, however, he probably stole the ram too to get the ewe pregnant, who knows. But he is able to keep that offspring. So the law goes down right to the very nth degree of what is correct and what isn't correct, what's fair and what's just. And it just, this is just an example of how intense this topic is. And you can understand the intricacies of the law and how important it is. There's this expression here, says if the owner, whether the owner despaired or not. I'll just explain that. When it says that, it means, for instance, we've all lost something. You know, you've put a pair of sunglasses on top of the bonnet of your car and driven off, and that's it. And you say, oh, I'll never see those again. That means that you've despaired of finding them. You've more or less said, well, they're gone. I'm not going to find them again. But for an owner to be not despaired, which is the opposite, we'll use the same scenario. You've put your glasses on top of the hood of the car and reversed out and turned the corner, and then you've realised when you go to reach for your sunglasses, you haven't got them. So you think, oh, I know what I did. I put them on the hood of the car. I'll just go back slowly. I'm sure I'll find them. I know I'll find them. And perhaps you do find them, perhaps you don't. But that's the difference. If the owner despaired, it means they've kissed it goodbye, so to speak. I'm never going to get it back. But if you've not despaired, it means you're still holding hope that you'll find the object or the object will be returned. And this can be verified in the laws of theft by your actual expression that you may make to people or to a friend. So again, there's so many intricacies. It's fascinating. Fascinating subject. So this is a very interesting point. I thought I would add this in. It's stealing from multiple people, but the thief does not remember who the victims are. So it must have been a busy thief by the sounds of it. And so what does a thief do then? Well, the correct thing for him to do or her to do is they should give the monetary value of those items that were stolen the value of that should be used for a community project. And they've got, in the example, was such as digging a well for water for which the entire community could benefit from that. Or in today's modern society, we could look for a similar community benefit. Now, that could be something to do with the education of children or perhaps a playground for children in the community, but it must be, the value must be put back into the community by which all can benefit. So that is a guideline that the thief has if he can't remember who he stole from, etc. So everything's covered in this law, isn't it? There's no getting out of it. If you've thieved something, stolen something, no matter what, there's an answer what must be done. So then we're going to look at the prohibition of aiding or benefiting from theft. And this is an example that I've chosen here. So the example is a tailor. You still see tailors around now in bigger cities, but once upon a time, nearly every moderate-sized town, at least in Australia, had a tailor. And men went there to have their suits and trousers and jackets made. Women had garments made there as well. So the tailor receives the material from the customer. Now, sometimes the customer would provide the material, or perhaps other times they'd select material that the tailor already had in his shop. But let's say the customer wants the garment made, they've brought material. Now, that leftover material from that garment must be returned to the customer along with and at the time of when the garment's completed. So you can't just keep those scraps. However, if the customer gives you permission to keep the scraps, you may do so. And I just want to pause here to give a little example. I still remember my father used to have his suits and trousers and jackets and things made at a tailor when I was a very young child. And I often went with him when he went to see the tailor. It was a nice experience because the tailor used to give me a needle and thread and some old scraps and tell me to make a dress for my dolly or something. Well, I didn't like dolls. I preferred to sew garments for my pups or whatever. But anyway, one of the things that tailor always did, I can remember Dad saying, keep the scraps. He didn't, why would Dad want them? But I'll tell you a little interesting thing. Do you know that even if the tailor was allowed to keep the scraps, or given permission to, most tailors would cut a sizable square, about the size of a pocket, if there was enough of the scraps, about the size of a pocket on a jacket, for instance, and they would tack that discreetly inside one of those pockets with the matching thread. Now, why do you think they did that? Well, that was in case there was a little tear or something happened to the garment. There would be the matching fabric plus the thread that they could retrieve or bring to the tailor to do the necessary repairs. And also, if it remained in the pocket, two things: it wouldn't get lost, and secondly, as the garment was either washed or dry cleaned or whatever, the the scrap would be wearing in keeping with the garment. So there wouldn't be a discrepancy of colour or appearance if there had to be a little patch made or something. And also I think they'd put a couple of buttons in as well, spare buttons. So I just thought I'd digress and tell you that. I don't know if tailors still do that today, but I thought it was fascinating and exacting, you know. So, theft by false measurement. And this is a fascinating one. And we could spend a whole hour just discussing this. And again, I've just used the most obvious things here to illustrate the importance of being accurate. So when it's dry or liquid measure, it doesn't matter, faulty scales of weight and faulty measuring tools. Now, the vendor must ensure that all their scales and measuring tools are accurate or exact and regularly calibrate, in other words, check. And this is done, for instance, when people are weighing gold and things, you can imagine how finely tuned those scales have to be. It's a fascinating thing. And there's a footnote on page 555, and I'm going to read that again as an illustration of how everything, it's not just one thing to say you must do this. There are some fascinating examples, and I'll just read this one to you again. This is on page 555 of the Divine Code, 3rd edition, and it's footnote 204. And this is the wordings of Rambam, and this is from the Laws of Theft, chapter 8, verse 3. And it goes on, Rashi explains there, one should not use, now this is interesting, one should not use the same rope for measuring land in the summer that he used in the winter. During the winter, it is wet, so the rope will stretch. And during the summer, it will dry and tighten. It appears that one who is measuring is committing a sin, even if he himself will not be getting any unfair benefit from the false measurement. And it goes on in another article to say if you were measuring land, they're using rope because they probably had, like we have a tape measure nowadays, we call it, a great big tape measure. Nowadays, for instance, measuring land, they have all sorts of electronic equipment now. But you can understand the complexity. So, and I read once where it said, even if you were measuring a plot of land and it was 1 finger width inaccurate, that is wrong. That's going to either be taking a finger measurement off the other person's property and, of course, adding it to yours, which would come under the prohibition of theft. But I just thought that was interesting, talking about the ropes. Would you have ever thought of that? Fascinating. So the Torah guidelines are for all times, aren't they? So it just shows that we have to be very accurate. We go on now to a topic called deception and cheating. And this again is talking about vendors, etc. Now, here's some other interesting things. It's forbidden to mix old merchandise with new. So an example of that would be if you were bagging up, say, tomatoes off your farm, you couldn't put, it's sinful to put the tomatoes that are a bit yucky or not perfect down the bottom of the bag, hidden by all the nice red, rosy, fresh, firm tomatoes on the top. And I wonder how many of us have been caught like this in time. And it's easy to think, oh, well, those were the last I used, so I suppose they're a bit soft. But sometimes they're put there intentionally. Something to think about. Here's another one. Forbidden to soak raw meat in water to imply it is fresher or heavier than it actually is, meaning when it's weighed. Noting. Forbidden to cheat in exams or tests, and it's forbidden to lie unless to save a person's property, their well-being, or to spare embarrassing someone. So here's an example. I always say that sparing someone embarrassment, or, you know, you can be too honest at times. Sometimes honesty can be really cruel. So, you know, if a friend comes out wearing a dress and it's totally ridiculous on them, just not appropriate for perhaps their age or their shape or size or whatever, you know, you're in a dilemma. What are you going to say to this dear person when they ask you, how does it look? Well, that's where sometimes you certainly have to soften the truth that can resemble what we sometimes call a white lie, and to protect embarrassing someone. There's lots of examples we've probably done that in our lifetime. You know, instead of what you really sort of think, you've got to say something that is more appropriate to someone else's feelings. And we're going to talk about the prohibition of extortion and forcing a sale. Now, extortion is something that you probably often read about in the news. You'll see things that could be coming under the definition of extortion. So what happens? Well, we're forbidden to force another person to accept an object for exchange, even money, if it's money, as well, even if it is more than its given value. The object can be a movable object, so it could be a piece of art or something like that, or a cow or something, or it could be something like real estate. Now, we've probably all read about or heard about examples of this, that I was saying, oh, it made me an offer I couldn't resist. Now, whether that's extortion or not, I guess, is in the eye of the person that is in the story. But we do hear sometimes in modern days, an example would be when a developer may want to buy land, and your home or your plot of land may be on the edge of it, and often people who don't want to sell will then be offered an enormous amount of money, far above market value. And so, I mean, there's two sides to looking at that. Are you ever going to win by refusing, or are they just eventually going to plough your house and land? You know, I guess you've got to be realistic when it comes to things like that. But anyway, that's technically how extortion works. Now, laws of borrowing and renting. This is a really big area as well. And to start with, the person who's renting or borrowing a piece of equipment, for instance, or renting equipment, or renting a house, they're responsible to make sure that they look after what they're borrowing or renting. In other words, they've got to guard it against theft, for instance, and any damages. So that would apply whether it's a house or a piece of machinery you're hiring or renting, etc. The loan or rental payments must be paid within the prescribed dates and for the agreed amount. Now, if you don't do that, that's theft. And people think, oh, well, I'll just make a late payment without contacting who they have to. I mean, there are means of getting around that. If you can't pay something on time, most responsible people in advance will ring whoever it is and they'll work out some agreement, in which case it's fine. But those people who just habitually don't pay their bills on time or don't pay their rent. Now, prohibition of kidnapping, and that's probably a surprise for some people, but it does actually come under the law of theft. And this kidnapping refers to three types, really, and that is to lure a victim with deception. And there's some examples often given about, for instance, beckoning a child or someone, come over and I'll give you a lolly, and then they're kidnapped. Or come look at this pretty puppy, come and you come over here and pat the dog, and then the child is kidnapped or the person is kidnapped. The second one is forcibly taking a person against their will. So that's when someone sets upon a person, or might be more than one person that sets upon them, and capture them and take them against their will. And then there's coercion, and that is the act of forcibly enslaving a victim, which again still comes under kidnapping. So I guess the best definition to say is that anyone who forcibly uses a person without valid consent from the victim is committing a sin. It is a form of theft resembling the act of kidnapping. So you see, and first up, if you were asked to list things that you thought would come under the category of prohibition of theft, would you think of kidnapping? Probably most of us wouldn't. But when you think about it, they are stealing your life, just as rape is. They're stealing a part of you. They're stealing you. Now, prohibition of rape, a violent and forbidden act. Now, this is, I'm going to read to you, I'm going to explain to you a little bit about this. But first of all, sexual activity forced upon a person against their will or without their intelligent consent is forbidden. Now, prior to the flood, this, all sorts of forbidden acts. Apart from robbery, there was violent rape and kidnapping of people, etc. Society was at an all-time low of even degradation. But after the flood, the nations were very, very particular in taking precautions against all manner of sins, but particularly in precautions against rape and sexual depravity. And if you want to read, there is actually a verse in Genesis chapter 34, verse 7, and that is in relation to the story of Dinah, who was taken against her will and violated. Now, I'm not going to go off step here now and talk about that, but later on after the class you can look up that verse. But certainly the nations and the leaders of those nations were very cautious about any sins, and particularly the sin of rape. They set up all manner of guidelines, like women were chaperoned. There were certain places they were advised not to go to because something might happen to them. Look, much like what we do in modern society, you warn people, look, don't go there, you might be in danger, you might get hit or something might happen to you. But they were very stringent after the flood in regard to all commandments and prohibitions, but particularly in the sin of rape. So bodily injury and damaging another person's property. Now that's forbidden. It's forbidden to injure a person's body. And injury is actually part of the Noahide prohibition of murder, and injury is considered also part of theft. And why is that? Well, that comes in because, for example, if you injure someone or someone is injured at work, etc., there is going to be a loss of income, because they can't work. And because of that injury, there is also going to be pain and or suffering. So we hear in today's terms compensation, and if people are injured in the workplace, there are laws and guidelines set in place whereby that person's compensated. It could be that they remain on their full pay, their medical expenses, etc. It's quite comprehensive, that commercial law in regards to compensation. And but it just shows you that it is still, if you injure someone, not only does it come under the prohibition of murder, but it's also, if it renders them unable to continue their actual normal way of earning an income, then it's also a part of theft, isn't it? You're robbing them. Because you injured them, you're robbing them of their ability to continue with their normal means of making a living, plus there could be added pain and suffering. So that in itself is a topic one could spend forever talking about. You know, I haven't got to all the questions yet. I will shortly, though, or comments. Now, a Gentile is forbidden to strike another person unless they're being pursued. I just added that in because, you know, when you're defending yourself, that's different. Therefore, it is logical, based on that a person should pay compensation for physical injury, just as would be paid for damages to another person's property. So therefore, that ties in with what I was saying on the previous slide, that, you know, if you take away a person's ability to earn their income, there's got to be some sort of restitution, as well as how much pain and suffering and how severe that actual injury is, of course. It could be a prolonged, permanent injury. It may be a temporary injury, etc. Now, we're going on here now to what was termed delinquent debtor and withholding payment that is owed. So a definition of that would be it's a person who does not pay his financial, contractual obligations on time or within the agreed time. Now, this applies to such things as your employees and creditors. It could be contractors, other service providers, transport services, etc. The list could be quite extensive. So that's just an idea of what a delinquent or what examples there are. Now, there's a question of bankruptcy. This is talked about as well. So when is it permissible and when is it fraudulent? And sometimes there's grey areas here. And thankfully, that's why in modern times we have lawyers that can sort this out and courts that can make judgment on this. But it's suffice to say that fraudulent claims for bankruptcy are a form of stealing, and from Hashem's perspective, it is stealing, and it's a sin. And there are times when people have exercised this right to file for bankruptcy when, in actual fact, I don't know how they get away with it, but anyway, that's for the lawyers to work out. But however, in our case, in today's society, whatever the law of the land is in our country or government, that is what determines the guidelines for bankruptcy. And you do hear about very wealthy people filing for bankruptcy, and it's usually to do with another company or organisation they're owning, and I don't know how they get around all that, but that's why they have good lawyers, I suppose. So bankruptcy is not something you can just do because I don't want to pay my commitments. I don't want to meet my financial commitments. There's got to be a genuine reason for bankruptcy to be declared. Now, we're moving on. This is an interesting topic as well. The law of employees. So employees have obligations to their employer or to their work, and they are expected to work according to the whatever the contract of employment is and the or the job description or both combined. And that's entered into with your employer. Now, most people in today's society, when you go to take a job, you've got to sign some sort of an agreement, and it will include usually what you're expected to do and maybe the hours and the wages you get, etc. So in that top, underneath that responsibility to your employer, there are things that you have to do. And they are things like, well, you've got to work the actual hours that you're designated to work. You can't just rock in an hour late and leave an hour early, and you can't always pick the days. You might have a roster system. You might work shift work, etc. So you've got to abide by that. You've got to also abide by the safety guidelines, and most places of work in today's society have extensive workplace health and safety guidelines, and they're there for a reason. Continuing on, the employee is to use their time in a meticulous way. That is, don't waste the employer's time. If you know that job's only going to take you 15 minutes to do, you don't waste time and spin it out for half an hour or an hour. That's dishonest. That's theft. Don't use your work hours for personal gain. Don't use your employer's stock or equipment for your personal use. Now, an example here, which is really something to think about, is taking home and keeping items provided for use at work, such as pens, nuts and bolts, scissors, screwdrivers, etc. So if you have a pen provided for you at work, this is an example, and naturally when you're using it at work, you put it in and out of your pocket and use it, and then you walk home with it, even, not deliberately. When you get home, it's not okay to take that pen out and put it in the pen caddy at house and say, oh, well, there's a free pen. No, you must return that pen. That is provided by your employer, and you as an employee are not permitted to keep that which belongs to the employer without their permission. So those pens that have got the company logo on them, unless they were personally given to you to keep, they need to go back to the employer. Another thing is, don't eat from the employer's produce. This would probably relate to years ago when you had to harvest things, maybe the fruit and the grapes. You couldn't just pick two for the employer and eat one for yourself. That was a very important law. Don't take extended meal breaks, etc. How many of you have worked for someone? Your meal break may be 30 minutes and they're gone 40 minutes, 45 minutes. They've always got some excuse. They're always late back. That is thieving from your employer. And it's also impacting on someone who is probably got to pick up the threads of your work while you're not there. So that brings us to a close of the prohibition of theft. Again, as I say, this is just a brief synopsis. It doesn't cover everything, but I wanted to give you some extreme examples and show you just how intricate the laws are and how exacting the Torah was in how it set down these guidelines. So most of our laws today are all going to stem back, particularly with theft, to a basis in the Torah, which I find just fascinating. So I'm just reading through the questions. Someone has put here, he would not have got the offspring if he had not stolen the ewe. That's very true. And to me, I would think, well, the ewe had the baby wouldn't have happened if he didn't steal my ewe. But then because the thief, this is the intricacy, because the thief brought in an external agent, as in the ram, then technically that lamb, when it's born, belongs to him. I know there's some very fine lines. Another person has said the thief should pay higher for the ewes as as damages or dam.
As a dam.
Oh! Oh, that's from you, is it, Stephen and Amos?
Yes,
okay.
yes.
Yes, and look, in today's modern law, there are additions to some of these laws, but what I wanted to do was just illustrate how fine the law is. As I've said, it's some of the things you think, oh, it doesn't sound too right, too normal, you know, but that's the way sometimes it went. And look, they're moving cattle here at the moment. Shush, 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 shush. I'll stop recording and then answer the questions because they're going to bark now. They think they should be out there mustering cattle, which is going to be an annoyance. So I'll just cease the recording and continue answering the questions. Thank you all for being present today for our lesson number 6, the Prohibition of Theft. And as we end this class, may I remind ourselves that, you know, always let the focus of our hearts and mind be on Hashem, and may he be with us always and guide us always. I'll see you all in the next class. Bye.